Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danielle, and on behalf of the Wood County Committee on Aging, we welcome you to our Lively You Virtual Learning Academy. The topic for today is women's rights, and we are going to go ahead and turn off everyone's cameras and audio and allow you to put any questions in the chat feature if you have any questions for us today. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Lee Hackle from the League of Women Voters. So welcome, Lee.
Thank you.
We're gonna go ahead and ask you a few questions and kind of do it as an interview today. So Lee, share with us what the 19th Amendment actually is.
Well, it's interesting because it's a very brief amendment. I'll read it to you. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's it.
So it seems so simple. Let women vote the same as men would, right? Why was it such a difficult thing to pass?
Well, it turns out it was anything but simple, because what this meant was a 180-degree difference in the way things were. At this point in history, women's roles were very proscribed. They were wives, mothers, homemakers, and many women wanted it to stay that way. It was not at all that all the women in the country wanted this to change. Women felt they would lose protection. They would be unladylike, that they would be mannish after this. But when you look at what their lives were like, if they owned property, suppose they'd inherited, at the time they married, that went to their husbands. They lost all control of that. They couldn't make contracts. They really could do very little in their own name. They were to be subjected to their husbands. They couldn't make contracts, but they could go to school. And the date I have found for the earliest graduates of a college were 1803. So what you have is something that's kind of creeping in. Women are getting more educated. Things are beginning to change, but slowly, very slowly. Men, on the other hand, are very fearful that they will lose control. They just think if women are allowed to vote, they will run for office. They could change the laws of the country. Some cartoons, a lot of cartoons actually, showed mom going off to vote, and she's all dressed up in her finest attire, and poor dad, weak and sitting there at home at the kitchen table holding two crying babies. The tea kettle is spouting, the bread hasn't been cut, and there's something broken on the floor at his feet. This really was the general idea of what would happen if women got the vote. So it was scary. It was a very scary time. So the women's task was to change the Constitution, but they couldn't vote for it, except some women out west and in Wyoming. People in Wyoming, women in Wyoming had been able to vote and even sent a woman to Congress. So it's a time of great upheaval and change.
So how many years did it take to get suffrage for women?
Almost 100 years. We generally count the beginning of the movement at 1848, but that's a sort of arbitrary date. And we say in the common story that everybody was there. Susan B. Anthony was there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there, and let's see, who's the other one? Oh, Lucretia Mott. But that story was concocted some years later. They had a meeting and they decided, well, we ought to have a point where we say this is where the movement started. So they picked that date. There was, in fact, a convention held in Seneca Falls, and to their great surprise, 300 people came. So it's a logical choice for where the meeting, for where the movement started. But remember, this had been coming along for a lot of years before that. So 1848 is the date usually given. But let me give you some context for that, and I have to read it. The Civil War ends in 1868, and then Reconstruction starts. In 1865, December, the 13th Amendment was passed, and that freed the slaves. In 1865, the 14th Amendment gave all male Americans, except Native American Indians, they were given the right to vote. And this is the 14th Amendment, is the famous Due Process Amendment. In 1910, immigration is really picking up. And in fact, that's the year that the first pizza was sold in America. So you've got immigrants pouring in, and that's changing things. 1914, World War I breaks out. In 1918, the Spanish flu comes to, well, it didn't come to America, and actually the Spanish flu started in America. 1920, well, in the background now, you've got the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, fighting for prohibition. You've got the two women's groups fighting for voting rights for women. 1920, prohibition was passed, and in 1920, the 19th Amendment was also passed. Of course, we know prohibition was repealed in 1933. But it took until 1964 in the Civil Rights Act before women were fully able to vote. So this is a time in our history of great upheaval, and some of it certainly was focused on the women's movement. So officially it took 78 years, but that's the official count, and in fact it was longer than that. The first time the 19th Amendment was introduced to Congress was 1878. It was defeated, and it was introduced every year for the next 40 years, and every year it was defeated. And in fact, it wasn't until, well, the House passed it in 1918 and 1919, the Senate passed it, and it went out to the states for ratification. And we all remember the story about how on August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to vote for ratification, and it passed by one vote. The story is that Mr. Burns took off the red rose on his lapel, indicating he was going to vote against it, because he got a letter from his mother that morning, and she was chatty, a very motherly letter, and then she said, "Be a good boy and vote for ratification." So then he picked up the yellow rose and he said, "Aye." And that's how we got the vote.
Wow. Great. So what is the difference between a suffragette and a suffrage?
A suffragette there was a women's movement in England, and they were termed in one of the newspapers suffragettes, and it was meant to be a term of derision. The ETT ending on it was diminutive. And so they said, the women in America said, "We will not use that." And they called themselves suffragists. So if you're talking about the women involved in the movement in the US, use the term suffragists.
Mm.
Let me tell you a little bit more about that. Alice Paul came from England. She had been there, and she was aware of the very aggressive tactics that the English women were using. And she thought that was the way to go about it. Now, the ladies who came out of 1848, they took much more ladylike tactic. They went and visited people in Congress. They wrote letters. They did all the usual ladylike things. Alice Paul said, "Get out there, picket, riot, march, be in their face." And that also happened. The first people to picket the White House with banners and such were women. And Woodrow Wilson was not concerned about it. He said, "Wait till it snows and they'll just go away." Well, they didn't go away. They picketed for 100 days through all kinds of weather. They marched. One of their biggest marches, it rained, torrential rain in New York City. And they just kept pushing. Well, those that picketed out in front of the White House got beat up by men. They were arrested for disturbing the traffic. Of course, they were on the sidewalks, so it was a made-up kind of thing. And they were put, I think, in Lorton prison. And there they went on a hunger strike. There were about 20 of them, and they went on a hunger strike, and they were force-fed. And I don't know if you've ever seen anybody be force-fed, but there are movies. And what they do is force your jaw open with a clamp, and then they put a pipe down, and then they take a funnel and pour food, eggs mostly. And this was very hard on the throat. It was usually women vomited. They lost a great deal of weight during this time, but it really focused attention on what was happening and how they were being treated. So when, this year, this 100th year, people say women were given the right to vote. And this group of women say, we weren't given anything. We got it. We took it. We earned it.
There were like silent vigils as well, right?
There were all kinds of things happening all over the country. It truly, well, except for the Western states where they did have a limited right to vote. They couldn't vote for everything, but the rest of the country, women rose up to do what needed to be done. But we had this two-track kind of thing all the way through. We had the folks from 1848 trying to be nice and polite and still work. And then we had Alice Paul's group saying, in your face. And it's, we can look back now and say, why didn't they work together?
Interesting. So anti-suffrage folks warned that passage of the 19th Amendment would change the world. Did it change the world?
I think it did. I really do. The women were so restricted. I remember hobble skirts. Have you seen pictures of that? I just saw a demonstration, and women could take these tiny mincing little steps. They could not wear pantaloons or whatever they were called at the time. This, from what they wore to how they acted, what they could do, what restrictions, what power their husbands had. Many of the women in the movement chose not to marry because you can imagine how scandalous that was. Because that meant giving up everything they owned, everything they had, and putting themselves completely in the control of a man. And in fact, not all of them, but some of them started wearing bloomers, they were called. I think it was named after Mrs. Bloom or something like that. It was a real person. So I think it did change the world with the 19th Amendment. Certainly none of us women would be where we are today.
So why were women of color not included in the suffrage effort?
Well, this is the sad part of the movement. The women who started were from northeast part of the United States. They were white. They were upper middle class. Some were quite wealthy. They lived in their own environment, and they were brought up to think that Black people were not as smart as white people. They were inferior. And so I think in their early days, they just weren't able to overcome what I would call cultural norms. There was a Black women's movement that came up again. So, we've got three. We've got the women from the Northeast, we've got Alice Paul, and now we've got the Black women working together. And I was happy to find out that Ohio was one of the states where Black and white women did work together for suffrage right from the start. You may be familiar with the name Ida B. Wells. If you're from Columbus or been there, you would know that name quite well. And Sojourner Truth, which everyone knows. So these are two outstanding women that came through the Black group. it seems to us wrong, but you have to put it in a cultural context. And at some point, they really had to decide on getting the vote for Tennessee. And it was all or nothing. If they didn't get Tennessee, it was all over. And the South was not going to allow them if Black people got the vote, Black women. And so there was this terrible decision made to separate from the Black women in the movement and to promise the South that Black women would not be included. It was a gamble. Get the whole thing and then amend it, like we did with the first 10 amendments. Slavery was not outlawed, and the idea was to get the Constitution and then amend it. And I think that's the way they plan to work with suffrage.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg got many laws changed to allow women equal treatment. Is the suffrage movement complete? Have we reached the goals of the suffragists?
Well, I saw an interview where she was asked this question not so long ago, and she gave a very firm no, because the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass. You know, as a trailer on that, Virginia did pass it in the last year, but it was long past the expiration of when that counted. So no, I think we enjoy rights that were unheard of for the women who started this, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg felt that without the passage of the ERA, which she worked for, it's not complete yet.
Why wasn't more done to celebrate the anniversary?
Well, a lot of things were planned. There were national things, there were state things, and we here in Northwest Ohio had a very active group. There were a small group, but representing the League of Women Voters of Toledo, Lucas County, Harrisburg, and Bowling Green. And we worked together. I think it's the first time we've had a coordinated effort over so many months. So I think we were 6 or 8 months, and we arranged 112 events and displays. And it all started on February 15th, 2020, which just happened to be Susan B. Anthony's 200th birthday, but that wasn't why we did it then. And we did it at the Valentine Theater. And we had 30 people from Bowling Green plus 20 Girl Scouts from this area. And we wore our white sashes that said "Vote for Women." And we gave out cookies. We had a big display. We had, I think it's 20 of these movable signs that, you know, floor to ceiling. And so it was much easier to go up to somebody and say, "Would you have a cookie?" with our logo on it, than to say, "Would you stop and read my poster?" Mm-hmm. So we got a lot of people that we could talk to, and every program had an insert about the history of the 19th Amendment. And it's no coincidence that the League of Women Voters is also 100 years old this year, because Carrie Chapman Catt, who started the League, realized that sooner or later women would get the right to vote. And she thought, they don't know how to vote. And if they don't get information, they're just going to vote the way their husband tells them, and then we haven't really won a new right. And so she started the League of Women Voters on February 14th. And we were really going strong. That was our kickoff on February 15th. And then COVID hit. And every single one of our 111 activities was canceled. We were going to have that display of the 20 pull-up posters at the atrium at the Wood County Courthouse. The commissioners were all for it. They were, you know, everybody around here wanted to get on board and get this word out and celebrate, really celebrate. But with COVID, I just went into it all. But what we did, we taped some TV shows And radio. You may have heard Chris Peterson on the radio giving a 30-second talk about local women who made a difference. And Backstory on WGTE is on the fourth Friday of every month. And again, it highlights someone, and then it's rebroadcast the next Sunday, I think, on WGTE in the morning. I mean, on WBGU. So Friday night's Backstory on WGTE, and then repeated BGSU, WBGU again. And it goes beyond the women in the early days of the movement. It's about contemporary women. And one of the cool things we had organized was going to be a suffragist tea in Bowling Green. And it was going to be at one of the wonderful old Victorian homes on Worcester Street here. And it happens to be the home where the first suffragist movement was held in Bowling Green. And that was going to be on March 6th. And the women, when they came in, were going to be given a piece of paper. And then the program would be for women in turn to stand up and read this little blurb about important women in our area. And it was going to be really cool, but we even rescheduled it twice, trying to get it in, but COVID continued.
So just a quick question. How many members of the League of Women Voters are there in the United States? Do you know offhand?
No, I don't know. In the United States, we have a national office in Washington, D.C. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of chapters like we have in Bowling Green. Here we have 94 members.
Okay, wonderful.
We're small but mighty.
Yeah, wonderful. Cultural norms are shared expectations and rules that guide our behavior. In 1919, Americans were asked to change their norms. Is that happening now?
It certainly is. You just need to turn on the news and see that we're again in the midst of a mighty movement for Black Lives Matter. And of course, the slogan is not good. I wish we had a different slogan. Obviously, all of our lives matter, but the focus is that Black people have not been treated well in this country. They do not have equality or equity. I saw an interesting cartoon about what's equality, and it's a bunch of kids trying to see a baseball game over the fence, and they've all got boosters of the same height, but the kids are different heights. And so that's equality. Equity is when the shortest kid gets a higher thing to stand on so they can all see over the fence. And I thought that was kind of interesting to see the difference between equality and equity. So yeah, we're always going through periods of change. Nothing quite as, I think, long or difficult as that period after the Civil War and up through World War I. But yeah, we have to look at our culture. What are our cultural norms? Is it right for a young Black man to be stopped because he's driving a car? The provost at BGSU is a man of color, and he is often stopped because he works late hours at the university and driving home. He is stopped by police and he has to worry. How's he going to be treated? And this is a man of great stature, but he's a Black man driving a car. So we have to take a look at our own cultural norms and see what we think about them. Are we doing the right things? Is change coming? Yes, it is. It's always coming, and change is hard for everybody.
As a woman of great wisdom, what would you provide in terms of knowledge for the next generation of women leaders in the country? I put you on the spot there.
Yeah. What would I provide? Or what would I encourage them to do? Is that what you mean? I'd encourage them to get involved. Don't just sit back and let things happen to you. My granddaughter is a woman of color, and she's just kind of been passive about everything until George Floyd was killed, and then she decided she had to do something. And she's gotten involved in several things and gotten active. Voting, people fought and died for us to have the right to vote. It's very important to go to the polls. And the league right now is stressing that go to the polls early. Early voting is going to make this election free and fair. And to that end, if I can put in a little plug for two things that are coming up. This Sunday, we are having a forum. And usually we have a forum in a room. Last year we had 289 people attend, and all the candidates come, and you can ask them questions. It's not scripted. They can't prepare in advance for it. There's no sound bites or anything like that. You can hear them talk in their own words about why they want to be elected and what they would do if elected. Well, we can't do this year because of COVID. So we're very happy that BGSU is allowing us to use their very large ballroom so we can have 100 people spaced out adequately. We have candidates in front, and WBGU is going to live stream it and record it for use on YouTube afterwards. So this is one thing we're doing to inform people. That's our mission, has been right from the start for 100 years. That's our mission. And on the 10th, on Saturday, we're going to do something we've never done before. We're going to have a car parade. I'm expecting 61 vehicles led by an antique red fire engine. And the idea is to drive around town, honk your horns, make a lot of noise, have a lot of signs, and say, vote early now, because early voting will open on the 6th. And this year, early voting is more important. We're expecting record turnouts, and going to your precinct on election day could mean long, long lines. And that's not good for everybody. So let's vote early. You can vote at the courthouse in person. They're setting up voting machines in the atrium so that they can be spaced. You will be safe. Everybody will wear masks. You can request a ballot now. It will be mailed. If you request it now, they'll start mailing the ballots on October 6th. Did I say June 6th? October 6th. And then you can either take them to the courthouse and put them in the drop box, or you can put them in the mail. For local Bowling Green, I would go to the drop box and put it in. It's safe, and your vote is in and will be counted. So I would urge people, young women, to vote. I would urge them to get involved, and I hope they would run for office. We need more women running for office. We need more women in the legislature and the governorship. I mean, someday we're going to have a woman president. Danielle, it could be you.
Only problem is I'm Canadian.
Well, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's a minor problem. Well, I really thank you so much for joining us today, Lee. You provided such valuable information on the history of voting for women and some great resources for local action. So it's much appreciated. At this time, we're going to pause the recording, and we're going to have an opportunity for our participants to answer questions.
I think Janice has a question.